Good evening. We're delighted that so many Society of Fellows members and friends of the Aspen Institute could be here. For those of you who it's your first time, welcome. We're celebrating the 5th year of the Morris Series, which is a program that I helped found with the Aspen Institute leadership to bring its mission and the work to the Bay Area. This series brings leaders to address innovation and technology with underlying theme of leadership and the enduring values of nonpartisan exchange. We're thrilled to have David Brooks join us this evening. He's going to talk about the cultural revolution that America needs and how it can turn itself around. I actually thought that we had a fireside chat, all poised. When I walked in, I was a little nervous. I see him with his teddy bear and kind of too relaxed for us, but I think it'll work out. David joined the Aspen Institute as an executive director last March to spearhead a bold new project aimed at bridging the differences that divide America and Americans, seeking to compel some common ground. The project's called Weave. We heard about it was in April, I guess, at our board meeting, and it's an incredible project and one that I personally hold quite dear. Weave will include a series of workshops in diverse communities across the country to identify unifying themes and promising partners. The initiative's longer-term goal is to draw attention to organizations that can heal some of our social divisions, and then to take it on a national level. So we're hoping to create a network and set some permanent structures in place so we can plan, have some dialogue, and then some action. David Brooks really needs no introduction. We've all heard him, read him in the New York Times. He's been writing there since 2003. He's currently a commentator on PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, Meet the Press. He teaches at Yale and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's written many books: Bobos in Paradise, On Paradise Drive, The Social Animal, The Road to Character, and in April, he's coming out with his next book, The Second Mountain, The Next Big Challenge in Your Life. So without further ado, I welcome David Brooks.
Thank you. Welcome to my Christmas special. Perry Como will be coming in a little later with a sweater. We'll be singing Silent Night. This is, I just from talking to people in the room, I have a feeling we have a high Jewish contingent in the room. So this is new to us. I grew up Jewish in New York and went to a school called Grace Church School in Lower Manhattan, which is on 10th Street and Broadway. And I was part of the choir, and the choir was about 40% Jewish, and so we would sing all the hymns, but to square with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus, and so the volume would drop down, and then it would come back up and kept singing. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a pleasure to join Aspen and to be part of the Aspen community. I'm going to describe a little later what I'm doing here and what I'm doing, but and what we've learned really traveling all across the country over the last 6 months. But I was talking to Ted somewhere out there about George H.W. Bush. And I had written this book about humility called The Road to Character a few years ago. And it was really about humility. And I wrote it in 2015, and then 2016 rolled around. And I thought, well, that worked. That solved that problem. But one of the things I learned in doing that book was George H.W. Bush hated talking about himself. And so the writers for the speeches would put these long paragraphs where he was supposed to say, well, he's running for president, why he'd be a good president. And he would chop them out. And they said, you got to talk about yourself, you're running for president. And so he finally one day included a little paragraph about himself. And his mom called him up, who was still alive then, and she said, George, you're talking about yourself. So that was a different era. And I'll talk a little about that. Now, it should be said that I've been this is the first time at Aspen I've ever had a team. I've learned to manage people. I've mostly lived my life just as a writer. And I am a bookish person. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I probably have not gone 200 days since then where I haven't written something. Remember in high school I wanted to date a girl named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me, she dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So we had different values. But I was sort of locked in. I went to a bookish college when I was 18. The admissions officers at Columbia, Brown, and Wesleyan decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which is sort of a bookish school. My favorite thing about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And the kids actually wear these T-shirts that say, sure, it works in practice, but doesn't work in theory. And so I was a bookish person, even by those standards. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there. And I'm sort of like the kids in my classes at Yale. I was able to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the readings. I was one of those obnoxious kids. At Yale, at Chicago, we called them seminar baboons who are always showing off. At Yale, they're called the section asshole. And the rule of a class is if you don't know who the section asshole is in the class, you're the section asshole. And the Yale Daily News actually prints a list every year of those who have been nominated. And I look at the list, like those are all my best students. But, so anyway, I was bookish, and then I got out and I got this career as a TV pundit or as a pundit. And even by TV pundit standards, I'm sort of a bookish category. I'm at the NewsHour, which is sort of bookish by TV standards. I do a segment with Mark Shields called Shields and Brooks. Should be called Brooks Shields. I would have been better, but they didn't do that. And we attract a certain audience, which I think of as an educated audience, though others would call it an elderly audience. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me at the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. We're very big in the hospice community. And then I got a job at 2003 as a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi in Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I started writing books and reading books, and I'm always have about 8 books going. But as my tastes have gotten a little older, I've learned, I think I've gotten a little softer, a little more feminine, like a lot of guys do. I'm the only American man to have finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love, if you know that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal, and all my friends joke that me writing about emotion is like Gandhi writing about gluttony, not the natural thing. And then I wrote this book 4 years ago called The Road to Character. And in the course of writing that book, I learned that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So all this to say is I'm a pretty heady guy. I built my career on neck up. And yet even I would have to admit that the rational brain is only the third most important part of the consciousness. And the first is the desiring heart. Our desires and what we really love and what we want. I read a book recently where it mentioned a guy who bought a house with a bamboo stand by the driveway, and he didn't like bamboo, so he chopped it down, and then he took an axe to the root system, then he dug a hole 3 foot deep, he poured plant poison in the hole, he put 3 feet of gravel, and then 2 inches of concrete on top. And 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo sticking up through the thing. And in my view, we all have that. We all have some desire that just won't go away. If you go to a school and watch little kids dancing in a school play, they're filled with desire to be good. They're focused, and sometimes we try to cover over their desire, but they're just born with it. And we are all desire, and I think a desire for fusion with another is the ultimate desire of the heart. To be with other people who we love and feel love from. The kind of completion that Louis de Bernier described in a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In the book, he's got an old guy talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And the old guy says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two. And I think that's what we're looking for. So that's the desiring heart. The second most important faculty is the yearning soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. That's not my department. That's other people in this room's department. But I do ask you to believe that there's a piece of you that has no shape, size, color, or weight, but is of infinite value and dignity. And that slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another human being's soul. That rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an obliteration on somebody else's soul. There's a philosopher, Roger Scruton, that says obscenity is anything that covers over another soul. What the soul does is it gives us moral responsibility. A tiger isn't morally responsible for what it does. A river isn't morally responsible for what it does, but we're morally responsible. And then it yearns. I've covered crime, I've covered wars, I've covered genocides, and I've met a lot of people who've done really horrible things. I've never met anybody who didn't want to be good and thought of as good. And the people who do the horrible things always have some rationalization to explain why what they did may seem bad, but it was actually good. And we just yearn for goodness, and yearn, I think, to serve an ideal, to want our lives oriented around some ideal. What Rabbi Wolf Kilman described, he marched in Selma with Martin Luther King, and he described what it felt like to be serving an ideal. He wrote, "We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest, most transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment." So in my view, some of our lives is spent in the economic sphere where we yearn for money or status or power. But I think the more fundamental drives are really for connection and for goodness. And so if you think that way, you look around society and you think, well, how are we doing at that? How much connection do we have? How much are people living in a world where it's easier for them to feel I'm really doing something really good and important and meaningful? Well, when you look around, what you see is a lot of, first, social isolation. A generation ago, 20% of Americans said they were lonely. Now it's 40%. 13% of Americans say no one knows them well. 35% of people over 45 say they are chronically lonely. Married couples entertain people in their homes 15 times a year. A generation ago, now it's down to 8. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversation with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. Work in the gig economy often means no regular office mates and you're sort of unaffiliated. And by 1,000 measures, social capital is declining. The second thing you notice about this culture is that a mammoth rise in distrust. If you ask people a generation ago, do you trust the institutions of your society? 80% said yes. Now it's 22%. If you ask them, do you trust your neighbors? Are the people around you trustworthy? A generation ago it was 60%, now it's 32% and 19% of millennials. The younger you go, the more distrusting they are. And as Robert Putnam of Harvard says, it's not perception, it's reality. They're distrusting because the people around them are distrustworthy. And so there's just mistrust. The third thing you see is a lot of social pain. 9 million working age men have dropped out of the labor force over the last 10 years. The suicide rate is falling across much of the world. But since 2000, the suicide rate in the United States has shot upward by 30%. Among teenagers, it's shot upward by 70%, which is one of the most shocking statistics that I know of. Every year, 45,000 Americans kill themselves. Every year, another 70,000 die of opiate addictions. In other words, just from those two ailments, twice as many people are dying every year as died over the course of the entire Vietnam War, and they're doing it every year. The CDC released a report last week that the U.S. life expectancy has dropped for the third consecutive year. This is unbelievable. In affluent countries, life expectancies go up. The only other time in American history where it's dropped for the third consecutive year was 1915 to 1918, when we were fighting a world war and 675,000 Americans died in a flu pandemic. So it's just an epidemic, what they call the diseases of despair. Fourth, there's a spiritual void. There's been a loss of faith in patriotism, a loss of faith in religion, a loss of faith in a shared morality. Christian Smith is a sociologist who asked young people to describe the last time they had a moral dilemma, and only 30% could name what a moral dilemma was. They just hadn't been given the moral vocabulary to think about what a moral dilemma was. A lot of the rest said, well, I wanted to rent an apartment, but I couldn't afford it. And Smith would say, that's not really a moral dilemma. And so it wasn't that they were bad, they just hadn't been given moral vocabulary. And so what happens when you leave people naked and alone? They do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, which is they revert to tribe. And so tribalism seems like community. It's a way to pull together. But community is based on shared affection. Tribalism is based on shared animosities. And so tribalism is always us, them, friend-enemy distinction. It's based on a scarcity mentality that our group is competing for scarce resources with some other evil groups. It's always a warrior mentality. Politics is war. Ideas are combat. Society is tribal. Build walls, erect barriers, keep you safe, believe in conspiracies. And I see it on politics of the right. Frankly, I see it a lot on campuses of the left. And tribalism is on the march. I was with the Wall Street Journal in the 90s, and I covered all these great news stories. I covered the unification of Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Maastricht Treaty, the end of the Soviet Union, the Oslo peace process in the Middle East, Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa. It was just one good news story after another. And it seemed like hostilities were ending. And then at the very end, I covered one thing I barely paid attention to, and it was the Yugoslav Civil War. But now, looking back on that time, that was the most influential event I covered, because the years since have been about ethnic nationalism and the rise of authoritarianism. And so that is just a historical shock to me. And so what happened? What caused this? To me, the ultimate answer, there are a lot of answers, but the ultimate answer is culture and values. If you go back to when George H.W. Bush was raised, it was a culture of self-effacement. I'm no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than me. It was a culture where they had to fight World War II, the Depression. They had a culture that was sort of, we're all in this together. It was a very group-oriented culture. And so if you lived in Chicago, you didn't say I live in Chicago, you said I lived on 59th and Pulaski, because it was your block that really mattered. And they didn't have TV, they didn't have air conditioning, so the kids were running from home to home. And it was very group-oriented. And it had some of the community that a lot of us yearn for. Of course, it had some bad things, too. It had racism, sexism, anti-Semitism. The food was really boring. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says it was like a guest house country. The house was really owned by the Protestant establishment. You could stay there if you played by their rules. And that became unacceptable to people. And so they smashed that old system. And they chopped it up, and they created a new culture. In 1962, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. In 1962, a bunch of kids from University of Michigan got together at Port Huron, and they said, we're tired of being conformist. We want to be individuals. And they all came here in 1968 and 69, and there was a flowering of individualism, which was a flowering of creativity, and you had this seismic cultural shift. To me, it was symbolized by one of the great moments of my childhood, which was Super Bowl III, which was like 1969 or 1970. The Baltimore Colts had a quarterback on one side of the field named Johnny Unitas. And he was like a classic 50s guy. Boring, crew cut, high top sneakers, did his job without saying anything flashy, just did his job. The other side of the field was a guy named Joe Namath from the New York Jets. They grew up 10 miles apart in western Pennsylvania, but 10 years apart. And those years were crucial. Joe Namath had long hair, flamboyant fur coats, did pantyhose ads. Namath wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. And so Johnny Unitas would not have written that memoir. And so you saw a shift in culture from we're all in this together to I'm free to be myself. And we needed to make that cultural shift. It liberated a lot of people. It also gave us a much more creative culture. I don't think we could have had Silicon Valley and the rebel culture there if we didn't have an individualistic culture that believed in doing your own thing. But in my view, we've sort of run out the string on individualism. And we've launched, after a lot of years of individualism of the right, which tends to emphasize economic liberation, and individualism of the left, which emphasizes social liberation, we have a lot of hyper-individualism. Hyper-individualism is a system of morals, feelings, and ideas based on the idea that life is an individual journey, that the goals of life are individual happiness, authenticity, self-expression, and self-sufficiently you ask, what can I do to make myself happy? And it's everything, the self comes before everything else. There's always a pendulum self in society. We're over on the self side. So we want freedom that's free from restraint. We want to spend a lot of time at work, so we don't have much time for community. We don't want our neighbors knocking on our door at 7 p.m. at night because we value our privacy. We value everything else over connection. And my problem with hyper-individualism, it emphasizes the systems of the surface. Consumerism, capitalism, all these things are great for individualism because it tells a story about an individual rising and succeeding. It desires the ego to make a mark. But what gets covered over are the parts of ourselves that are all about connection. What gets covered over is the heart and the soul. And eventually, if you live in what philosophers call a buffered life, those parts of you, the heart and the soul parts, get quiet and numb, and they're just covered over. And people understand that they're yearning for something, but they lose the ability after a while to even mention what it is. And you end up with a society with all the social maladies I've just described. Now, when George H.W. Bush heard about Pearl Harbor, he marched right into the recruiting station and volunteered for the Navy. And we don't have anything as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but when 45,000 people die every year of suicide and 70,000 die of addiction, that seems to me like a silent Pearl Harbor. When the basic norms of our democracy and telling the truth are under threat, that seems to me like a silent Pearl Harbor. And it seems to me like one of those moments when we're all called upon to do something extra. And so I was happily writing my columns and doing my normal neurotic whatever. And I thought I should try to do something extra. And so that was to go to the Aspen Institute and see what I could do to create some sort of cultural change. A lot of people have programs, and that's great. But I'm a cultural determinist. I believe culture changes things. I worked for a guy I mentioned before named Jim Lehrer. I worked for him for 10 years before he retired. And I was on the show, and when you were watching TV, Lehrer's face was pretty stoical. But when he was off camera, his face was very expressive. And when I would talk, and I would say something he really liked, his eyes would crinkle in pleasure. When I said something he didn't like, his mouth would downturn in disgust. And so for 10 years, I just tried to chase the eye crinkle and avoid the mouth downturn. And so he never had to say anything to me. But he set up a standard of how you behave on the NewsHour. And he not only set that up for me, but all the staff. And he's been gone for about 8 years, but the Lehrer culture is still there. He created a moral ecology around that organization, and the culture lives on. And a very powerful thing to do is to create a culture. And we're all in this together culture, which determined behavior. I'm free to be myself. And it looks like we're heading toward a culture that says we revert to tribe and 50 years of tribalism. That's not an attractive prospect to me. So how can we shift the culture in a better direction? Well, I think we can do it in two ways. The first, we're not going to go back to the deference to authority of the 1950s. But the first is to organize our own personal lives around commitments, around the promises we make to another and the fulfillment of those promises. Most of us in the course of our lives make 4 big commitments: to a spouse and family, to a vocation, to a philosophy or faith, and to a community. And the fulfillment of our lives depends on how well we choose and then execute those commitments. We often don't think of that. In the obits, it's like, what did you do professionally? That's what determines your life. But if you really want to measure your life, it's how did you fulfill your commitments, your promises? How deep was the quality of your relationships? Now, what's a commitment? A commitment is a promise made from love. You fall in love with a person, you make a promise and a marriage vow. You fall in love with a city, you make promises to it, even though there's no marriage ceremony to a city or to a job, but probably there should be. A commitment is often going against yourself. But a commitment is not only a promise, it's not only falling in love with something, it's putting that promise under law, having a discipline to stick with it. My favorite definition of commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. So Jews love their God, but they keep kosher just in case. We need the structures of behavior to keep us consistent and on track. And what our commitments give us is first our identity. Hannah Arendt said, without being bound to the fulfillment of our promises, we would never be able to keep our identities. We would be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction of the darkest of our each lonely heart. Our commitments give us a sense of purpose. In 2007, the Gallup organization asked people all around the world, do you have a sense of purpose and meaning in your life? The country where most people had a sense of purpose and meaning in life was Liberia. And it wasn't because life was so pleasant in Liberia. It's because to survive, they really had to commit strongly to one another. The place where the people had the least sense of purpose and meaning was Denmark, which is actually a very pleasant place. Our commitments also, I think, build our moral character. I wrote this book, The Road to Character, believing that character was like going to the gym and you work out, you build your honesty, your grit. And then I noticed that a lot of the characters in that book had amazing moms. Their dads were meh, but their moms were amazing. And there was something about that. And then I remembered when my son was, my oldest son was born in Brussels, he came out, he had a super low APGAR score, he came out blue and in trouble. And in those circumstances, they whisk him up to the intensive care ward. And that night, you don't know what's going on. And I remember thinking that night, what happens if he only lives for 30 minutes? Will that be worth a lifetime of grief for his mother and I? And if you had asked me that question before he was born, I would have said, no, that's ridiculous. How could 30 minutes of a being that doesn't even know it's alive be worth a lifetime of grief for two other people? But after the kid was born, it seemed obvious to me that of course it would be worth it. A child's life is of infinite value, no matter how long or short it is. And so what happened when he was born is I was seized by a commitment that I didn't even know could exist. And I'm sure all parents have felt it. And when you're seized by that kind of commitment, you want to make promises to it. I'll always be there for the kid. You start behaving a little more selflessly. I want to play golf, but I'll push the kid in the baby carriage. And if you do that often enough selfless behavior, it becomes ingrained in habit, and it becomes ingrained in character. And so to me, our moral formation is in the selflessness and the way our promises to the things we love can crush the ego and arouse the heart and the soul. And so if you want to teach somebody good character, have them make commitments and then live up to those commitments. And to me, that's personally how you begin to shift culture, by defining things not by who our lives, but not by who we are, but what we've committed to. Then the second way is more broadly communal. And it's about how do we build community and how do we live in community with each other. Now, we created this organization called Weave under the idea that some things we all do weave community and create the social fabric, and some things we all do rip community and destroy the social fabric. And so we wanted to find out people who were masters of weaving. And so we've been around the country for 6 months meeting some of the amazing people. And what we found is these people, they may not be smart, they may be smart, but they are geniuses at relationship. And they have a hunger for relationship. I'm involved with a community in DC called AOK. It was started by a couple named Kathy and David. Kathy and David had a kid in DC public schools who had a friend whose mom was on drugs and had health issues, so there was no food at home and no bed. So they said James can come over and stay with us. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had friends. And so when I went over to their house for the first time about 5 years ago, there were 40 kids having dinner there, and about 13 living there. And they had just taken kids who needed some. And I walk in there the first time, I'm invited by a mutual friend, and I reached to shake hands with one of the kids. He said, "We don't really shake hands here, we hug here." And I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I've been hugging every Thursday night for 4 years, or 5 years ever since. And they go around the table, and everyone says something you don't know about me, some achievement. They put something on the table, I'm suffering from depression, or I got my GED, or something. And it's 40 kids who all share. I brought my friend Bill Milliken, who does youth work, and he's in his 70s. And he says, I've been in this business for 50 years. I've never seen a program change a life. I've only seen relationships change lives. And so these kids call Kathy and David mom and dad. I brought my daughter, and she said, I've never seen a warmer place in my life. And they just beam love at us and at each other. One of the kids 2 weeks ago, named Madeline, her kidney failed. And so David donated a kidney. And it's just like an extended family. And so that's genius, a relationship. They all have a technology for intimacy. For us, it's that dinner table at AOK. There's a thing called Becoming a Man in Chicago, where they go around, they take gang members on the West Side, and they have a check-in. They all have to tell each other how they're doing relationally, intellectually, spiritually, physically, and emotionally. And if they don't come fully vulnerable, the other guys get on them. So it's a technology for intimacy. There's a group called Roots of Empathy by a woman named Mary Gordon. She goes into classrooms where the kids have come from sometimes disorganized homes, and she puts a green blanket on the floor, and she brings a mom with an infant. And they sit on the floor, and the kids, 8th, 10th graders, surround them, and they have to guess what the infant is thinking. It gets them empathy. How do I think through this person? There was a kid named Darren this was in 8th grade, who was gigantic. He'd been held back. And so he was just bigger than everybody else and frankly scarier than everybody else. And Darren went to the mom with the infant and said, can I hold your baby? Mom was a little nervous, but she gave Darren the baby, and he took the baby over to the windowsill and sat by the windowsill. And it turned out he was amazing with the baby. He just snuggled him, the baby came back, and Darren had been through the foster care system, but somehow he knew how to hold babies. And he handed the baby back to the mom, and he started asking questions about what it was like to be a parent. And the final question was, do you think you can be a good father if no one's ever loved you? And so you're just trying to break through intimacy and create fulfillment where there was a void. The third thing you notice is radical mutuality. Charity is the ultimate dirty word. We all are walking through this together. There's a woman named Sarah Heminger who started something called Thread in Baltimore. She took the lowest performing kids in a school. She grew up in Indiana, and her dad at her church reported on the pastor who was embezzling. And instead of firing the pastor, who I guess they liked, they ostracized her family. So for 8 years, she and her brother had no one to speak to at group parties and in the playgrounds. And so she knew social isolation. She compensated by becoming a very good figure skater and then a very good scientist, and went to Johns Hopkins to get her PhD. But she saw some kids at something called Dunbar School, and she saw them just looking lonely and isolated. And she knew exactly what that was like. So she got the list of 450 of them. And she's created this engineering system. She's a chemical engineer. So around each kid, there are 4 volunteers. Around each of the volunteers, there are 4 what they call grandparents, and then 4 collaborators, and then a whole bunch of other things. So it's this elaborate system of relationships. She's actually, when a volunteer meets a kid, their phones are next to each other, and it shows up on her app. So she can tell when a kid has been touched and when a kid has gone 3 hours without a touch. She calls it the Fitbit of social relationship. But she will not use, it's basically a mentoring program, but she will not use the word mentor because it implies some people are higher and some are lower. She says, we're all broken, we're all going through this together. I'm healing my loneliness as much as theirs. Another trait that you notice in a lot of these people is, I call it a hole in the soul. They've had something bad, like Sarah, happen to them, and they're going to make sure it doesn't happen to others. Darius Baxter was a kid in D.C. who, his dad, when Darius was 9, had an affair with a stripper who arranged his murder. And now he runs a football camp, so other kids will have fathers. The most shocking case I came across in Appalachia in Ohio, a woman named Sarah Adkins, She had 2 kids with a husband, and they were having marital difficulty. He was having mental difficulties. 5 years ago, she went off antiquing for a weekend with her mom, and she called in, but she couldn't reach them. She came home on Sunday afternoon about 5, and she pushes open the door, says, I'm home, hears nothing, sees the mattress has been shoved on the basement, the floor of the basement, the mattress is in the doorway. She goes downstairs, sees her husband slumped over, doesn't really process what she's seeing, sees her kid on the bed with what looks like chocolate, touches him, he's cold, sees the other one, and her husband had killed the 2 kids and himself. And now she works at a free pharmacy, she teaches pharmacy, she works at a free health clinic, she raises money so moms whose kids are the victim of violence will have support for the funeral and things like that. And she lives a life of complete altruism. She's a bit on the edge. You see the emotions going through her. It's been 5 years. She hasn't really recovered. But it's a life of complete service. And she says she does it partly out of anger, that whatever that guy tried to do to me, she says, fuck you, you're not going to do it to me. And so there's a mixture of compassion and anger you see in a lot of these. And so there's a motivational shift in all these cases, a moral motivation. They assume responsibility. The phrase I've heard the most is the whole person. We got to treat the whole person. They want to get the heart and the soul, not just give money or something for the food. They believe that we are enough, that we as a community can take care of all our problems. They have community stories, community projects, and the thing they have most is vocational certitude. I've met now 500 or 600 of these people, and I've never had one say, I'm doing this for a few years, but maybe I'll do something else. They all say, I'm going to die doing this. This isn't work for me. This is just what I do. They've achieved that thing called the double negative. I can't not do this. And so what you see is not only heroism, in some cases they're living lives that a lot of us could not live. But what you see is a philosophy of life. You see a philosophy of life and a culture that says the individual is not at the center of attention, relationship is at the center of attention. That articulates in clear forms the truth that we all know, that we're formed by relationships, we're nourished by relationship, we long for relationship, and ultimately the measure of our lives is the quality of our relationships, not quantity, that life is a qualitative endeavor, not a quantitative one. And you see almost a philosophy of relationalism. It's not hyper-individualism, and it's not collectivism where the individual is submerged. There's a guy named Eugene Peterson who says sometimes we talk in the active voice, which is I'm commanding you, and sometimes in the passive voice, which says I'm listening to you. But there's also a middle voice, which is conversation and response. And that there's all this solidarity. And so, in my view, the social fabric is not woven by leaders from above. We sort of have a political sphere up here and an economic sphere up here. But down here, it's a system of relationships and trust, which are really the foundations of society. And this is where our problem is. And the people who are these community healers, they are the answer to the problem. They are living lives and spreading values which are the answer to the problem. And the hard part is it's not like there's good people and bad people. We all are sometimes on the side of good and sometimes on the side of bad. When you treat somebody as an infinite soul, you've woven the social fabric. When you lie or stereotype or traumatize a person, you've ripped it. When you see someone deeply, take time to make them feel fully known, you've woven it. When you accuse someone of corruption without evidence, you've ripped it. When you disagree without maligning motives, you've woven it. And so it's a whole series of actions we do every day. And relationships, which are the core of the thing, don't scale. They're really built every day. But norms do scale. And cultures do scale. So basically what we're trying to do is learn from what they're doing and then find ways to introduce their ideas into the cultural mainstream. And the final difference I've noticed about the way they live and the way a lot of us were raised is the difference between happiness and joy. Happiness happens, we feel it, when life is going well. We achieve a goal, we win a victory. My team, the Mets, wins the World Series, which has only happened twice in my lifetime. So it's about the expansion of self. Joy is generally about the transcendence of self. It's when we feel ourselves merge with something else. I've sort of become interested with these people because they talk so much about joy. And I've begun to collect little descriptions that people describe what joy feels like. There's a great scene in Anna Karenina where Levin, who's the best character in Tolstoy, is cutting grass. And he loses track of where he ends and the scythe begins. It's just this smooth motion of workplace flow. In 1999, the novelist Zadie Smith was in a nightclub in London, and she was wandering about looking for her friends, wondering where her handbag was, when she heard a group called A Tribe Called Quest on their sound system. And as she writes, a rail-thin man with enormous eyes reached across a sea of bodies for my hand. He kept asking me the same thing over and over again, are you feeling it? I was. My ridiculous heels were killing me. I was terrified I might die, yet I felt simultaneously overwhelmed with delight that Can I Kick It should happen to be playing at that exact moment in world history on the sound system and was morphing into Smells Like Teen Spirit. I took the man's hand, the top of my head flew away, we danced and gave ourselves over to joy. That's like collective effervescence. That's like dancing, which all cultures do. The next layer of joy is what you might call emotional joy. The joy we feel when we are really in deep relation with another. One of my heroes is a woman named Dorothy Day. And when Day was about to give birth, she realized that all the accounts of childbirth she'd ever read were written by guys. So she wrote one 40 minutes after her daughter was born. And she's a description of what the pain felt like. But it ends with this. If I had written the greatest book or composed the greatest symphony or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt at the birth of my child, and with that came a need to worship and to adore. Her whole life was turned on that moment. The writer David Wright makes a core point about joy. Joy is a meeting place of deep intentionality and self-forgetting. The bodily alchemy, what formerly lied outside of us, in communion with its inside. Dance, laughter, affection, skin touching skin, singing in the car, music in the kitchen, the quiet, irreplaceable, and companionable presence of a daughter. I have a friend named Christian Wyman who's a poet. And when you ask him about where he lived in his young life, he mentions random cities, and you say, well, why'd you live in Buffalo? He said, well, there's a girl there. And why'd you live in Prague? And there's a girl there. He was always chasing girls. And he was living with a girl in Prague, and he was sitting in the window in the kitchen writing poetry. And a falcon landed on the windowsill, and he was amazed by the beauty of the bird. And so he called to his girlfriend, who was taking a shower. Come here, you got to see this. So they're standing, and she's dripping wet, and the bird turns its head and locks eyes with Wyman. And they just sit there like the bird and him having some mystical connection into the ineffable. And he just his girlfriend, the bird, nature, poetry, he just felt everything like sort of glow. And his girlfriend understood the moment and said, make a wish. And he wrote a poem about the experience, which includes the stanza, and for a long moment I'm still in, I wished and wished and wished and wished that the moment would not end. And just like that, it vanished. So that's a touching of the transcendence. But the thing I've found, and I bet we've all found this, is that you meet some people for whom joy is not just a moment, it's a permanent state. They just radiate joy, gratitude. They just have an inner light. And I meet these people, I think, well, I've achieved more career success than I ever thought I would, but I don't have that. I once was seated next to the Dalai Lama at a Washington function, and the guy just radiates joy. He just starts laughing for no reason. And I'm sitting next to him, and I want to be polite, so I start laughing, and he would laugh, and I would laugh. And I finally asked him, I didn't know what to say to the guy, so he had this little Dalai Lama bag. And I said, you got any candy in your bag? And he starts pulling out everything in the bag. It's basically everything you get in the first class cabin of an international flight. It's like a razor. But he just radiates joy. And the perverse things about the people who radiate joy is that they haven't led lives. They've taken on burdens in life. They've taken on the care for others. And somehow they've managed to sink out of the ego down back into their heart and soul. Greg Boyle, who's in LA, works with gangs, says compassion is always at its most authentic about a shift from a cramped world of self-preoccupation into a more expansive place of fellowship. And that's, to me, the ultimate cultural shift. From the ego that is always insecure, that is always wanting more and more, that is always incoming, to the heart and soul, which are always outpouring. And my book, which is coming out, well, if it finishes in the next week, is about people who began their career and they thought they knew what they were going to do with their lives. They thought the family, home, company, and maybe they achieved success and found it kind of unsatisfying. Or else they failed, or something bad happened and they were in the valley. And in the valley, the desires of the ego just got crushed, and the ego was blasted away. And then they looked up and said, well, that wasn't my actual mountain. The next mountain, which is giving back, pouring forth, that's what I really want out of life. And to me, the country right now is in the valley. But I have every optimism that in this moment, suffering can be very productive as long as you connect it to a narrative of redemption. And so it's our job in this moment to connect it to that kind of narrative and make use of this moment of hard times. Thank you.
Mics, but we would love an opportunity for the audience to be able to ask a few questions of David if you are willing. There are mics built into the ceiling, so if you just use your loud voice, then we can get this all on video for legacy purposes. So questions?
It's like the Kardashian bedroom up there. Mics in the ceiling. In the back.
How does the role of technology in our lives play into this individualistic theme? We can all go watch our own show on our own device. We can all get our personal entertainment right at a moment's notice. Do you think that factors into what we're dealing with?
This is always an awkward question in the Bay Area. I formerly was a believer that technology, like there was these articles, is Facebook making us lonely? And there was generally the evidence was, no, it's not it's not Facebook, it's what you bring to Facebook. That Facebook was more or less neutral, that if you had a lot of friends, you used Facebook to augment your friendships. If you didn't, you could mask your loneliness with it. Since the introduction of the smartphone, it's been hard to think that technology is now neutral. That 70% rise in teenage suicide, it correlates completely to the introduction of the smartphone. And partly it's just the scattered attention, partly it's the constant comparison. And you know, I'm glad I didn't know about the parties I didn't get invited to in high school. But now on Instagram, you know. And so it's hard to believe that it hasn't had some negative effect. And the good news is that I think my friends in Silicon Valley are trying to do something about it. Not sure what they figured out, but Facebook is trying to have more social groups. The people are trying to figure out how do we use our technologies to create more face-to-face interactions. And I think one of the things we've learned about depression is that the more time you spend on here, the more likely you are to be depressed, and the more face-to-face interactions, the more likely you are not to be depressed. There's a study at the University of Michigan I read recently. They had a bunch of people do math problems. Some could communicate by email, some were face-to-face. The groups that were face-to-face could solve the problems easily within 10 minutes. The groups that communicated by email could never solve the problems. Because so much of our, even in math, so much of our communication is verbal signals, so much is smell. Like there's just so much that goes on face-to-face. We're learning the vast difference between the two.
You work in a college campus. I'm interested to know what that feels like for the young people and the disenfranchised.
My rule, I borrow this from a friend of mine named Jonathan Haidt from NYU. He says if you haven't been on a college campus in the last 3 or 4 years, you don't know what's happening. It's totally changed. I've been teaching now on and off for 13 or 14 years. It used to be they treated our professors like we're the boss and their job was to please us. And they were, I call them the organization kids, they were too deferential. Now there's a level of moral one-upsmanship that can be brutal. They're brutal on each other. So one of my students said, you know, if there's a moral wave going through campus and you haven't posted on Facebook, within 6 hours people notice and you're judged. It's like there's a lot of moral passion out there, but there's a lot of fragility and insecurity. I have theories about why, but they just they take it out by wanting to show they're more morally superior than their neighbors. And so you get these hazing rituals. I mean, we hear about all the speakers that are disinvited. That's the least important part. It's the sense of moral panic that I'm not safe because people are always out to get me. And so you've seen this dramatic rise where now I think 40% of the students are trying to get access to the mental health system on college campuses. It's just become a very different place where everybody is on edge. And it's spreading from the campuses to the tech firms and to the wider culture. But it's become a very weirdly frightening place to be around. And I say that not on behalf of the adults, but the students.
I think that when you talk about tribalism, a lot of us are inclined to think of it in political terms, in two-party terms often. And I know that creates a framework that is very challenging for me and people in my tribe to figure out how to reach the other tribe. And I'm curious to know if you believe, or if you have some insights into whether that political tribal frame is the one we should be applying when we look out at our broader community, or are there tribes or divisions that we're not recognizing because the political framework is blinding us to the real nature of things?
Yeah, well, I guess when I look at the groups that I've been studying, some of them do political polarization. The best one is called Better Angels, and they basically take reds and blues together, and they're marriage counselors, so they know what they're doing. And one of the things they do, the reds say, here are the stereotypes that you guys say about me. And then the blues do the same. And they do that so the stereotypes will get on the table, but not in an accusatory way, but so people can say, this is what you say about me. And what they've find is there's just triggers they didn't know about beforehand. Conservatives hate the word dialogue because they think you're just going to tell me how bad I am. And so, they tried to meet in a church which had a hate is not tolerated here. And the Reds would not go in because, well, if you're saying, are you saying we're haters? And so it's just this very delicate operation. But so that's one group. But then there's racial justice reconciliation, which is probably the dominant issue that comes up in our conversations. And sometimes I go away thinking, well, this is the core sin of the country. Until we solve this one, we're probably not going to make much progress in the others. There's the rural-urban, which is very serious. There's the coastal-inland. I could probably go on with 6 or 7 ways. We're dividing in 8 million ways. There's a gigantic generation gap, once again, which is typical of moments of historical transition. At the New York Times and every other magazine I know, all the editors are progressives. They're on the left, but they don't recognize the kids under 30. There's just a vast difference all of a sudden. And so what you see is a country that seems to be fragmenting in a million different ways. And I think it's the product of hyper-individualism and then the people's reaction to it, wanting to have some sense, I gotta belong somewhere. There are other things, there are economic things, there are historical things. But it's certainly not just red-blue.
Where does growing income inequality fit in?
Well, that is yet the class divide is yet another one. And all these exacerbate all the others, by the way. And so, I don't know, I've spent so much time now at comfort inns around Appalachia. And a lot of the social capital indicators are directly related to income. So a lot of affluent places, people go to church way more if they're college educated, and they go to church way less. They volunteer more. In the 1960s, family structures across classes, there was not a big economic difference between the rich and the poor in family structure. But now there's a vast chasm of basically people in the upper educated class with 1950s demographics, getting married, staying married, people down below not getting married, can't find a partner, can't find somebody who has a job, can't find somebody who's not out of prison. And so you've just got this vast social chasm that correlates with the income chasm. And I think we've had a stupid debate with one side saying, well, it's about culture, which is what I have argued tonight, then another saying, no, it's about economics. But the two are so completely intertwined, it's silly to think about one without the other. They just dance with each other.
Donald Trump. How does he fit into what you're saying?
Well, I do think if you live in a part of the country where you feel invisible and basically your entire social structure is just catastrophically collapsing. I mean, there must be people in this room who have loved ones who've perished from opiate addiction. But if we go to Appalachia, everyone. Suicide, everyone. And so that you see basically your social structure collapsing, and you say, well, that guy's a jerk, but he's my shot at change. He doesn't like the people I don't like. And so I do think he is a product. I will also say, if you talk about a culture of hyper-individualism, I mean, he is as lone a wolf as it's possible to imagine. One of the differences between happiness and joy is that a narcissist can be happy, but a narcissist cannot be joyful, because self-erasure is the one thing they can't do. And so he's never joyful. He's always insecure. He's never quite getting enough praise. He seems always unhappy because he's not being affirmed enough. I had dinner with somebody who was in his administration last night, and he said he treats Melania like she's the head cheerleader, he's just trying to oppress her all the time. And it's just this sad longing to somebody to love him, but he's making himself isolated and unlovable. Being a little partisan here, but we're in the Bay Area. And so I do think if you wanted to pick a person who's the poster child of solitude and individualism, narcissism, and selfishness, to me he'd be the poster child. And so if you wanted to build off a negative example, he's the nice thing to react against, whether you're on the right or the left. And so in a weird way, I sometimes look at him as an opportunity, because he illustrates a lot of our cultural maladies in such pure form. And so, as Lenin said, the worse the better. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you again, David, for joining us. I know you'll be back in April with your book. We can't hear about the mountains.
The City Arts and Letters, lectures.
No,
I'm sure.
JCC too.
Oh, JCC too.
I think you're doing the run, so
Okay.
we look forward to that. Thank you, Diane, as always, for all of your generosity and leadership for bringing this. Please save the date for February 7th. We have a great program about China. It's going to be at SF MoMA. It's set against the backdrop of the current exhibition, which is really fascinating, and so hope you'll join us. You should be receiving an email soon. If you have any questions about what we're up to here in the Bay Area and beyond, please see me. We'd love to have you join us for future programs. And with that, thank you and good night.
She said she might want to be around.